Chasing the Antifa unicorn. Well, everybody, welcome back to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. Most grown-ups know that unicorns don't exist. Likewise, in Northern California in June of 2020, there was not a bus or busloads of Antifa people running around Northern California spreading mayhem. However, that was the impression that several local law enforcement had in Northern California and in Oregon, and it has sparked all kinds of chaos. Joining us to talk about this is Sam Levin. He's a correspondent for The Guardian who has been writing about all of this. Sam, what happened?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So there were a lot of rumors flying around at the beginning of the sort of George Floyd protests in early June of last year on social media that, busloads of Antifa protesters were coming to these small towns to, attack people and cause mayhem. These rumors were not true and, were sort of quickly debunked by fact checkers and, researchers on the far right. However, I obtained records of how police in California, in Northern California, were talking about these Antifa bus rumors. And those records showed that police took these rumors very seriously and in fact appeared to be duped by these hoax social media posts. So we saw in Northern California that the California Highway Patrol and a couple of their police departments were engaged on this matter, and in fact actually launched a sort of aerial surveillance in response to just 2 social media posts looking for potential Antifa buses.
And what was the reaction from local communities when law enforcement has all of this chatter about something that's not happening, but they think it's happening? And then a lot of people must have fed off of the reaction from law enforcement to be terrified or frightened unnecessarily.
Yeah, it's a bit of a feedback loop because you do have a lot of fear in these communities and a lot of misinformation. And then you had police officials kind of passing along this misinformation, stating it as fact when in fact it was not true. And so, in Oregon, we saw some very scary examples of, these sort of militias popping up, as well as just, civilians arming themselves to kind of protect their towns from, potential Antifa protesters when there really was no evidence that this was happening at all. And certainly no, buses of protesters traveling from city to city to cause mayhem. So there were a lot of people who believed these rumors. And, in the story I reported in Humboldt County, in Northern California specifically, the sheriff there repeated these claims and then continued to sort of double down on them and raise concerns about Antifa threats, even after the claims had been debunked and it was clear that there were no busloads of Antifa coming to town.
Why was it that the sheriff in Humboldt County was not able to either do his own due diligence or check it or believe the fact checkers? I mean, what was it that, is it a lack of resources? Is it a lack of time? Why is it just as preconceived stereotypes? I mean, what would lead the sheriff of a small community like this to buy into such nonsense?
Well, the rumor amongst police departments actually started with the California Highway Patrol, which is obviously a state agency. And so from the emails, what we were able to gather is that the basically a chief in the Northern Division of the California Highway Patrol sent along 2 screenshots to partner agencies across the region. One was from Instagram and one was from Facebook. They were these sort of weirdly cropped, dubious screenshots that anyone could look at them and think, these don't look super legitimate just on quick glance. But they sent that along and basically was forwarded to a bunch of police leaders who all just said, be on the lookout for Antifa buses, watch out. And it quickly, we saw within just hours, it spread and police were talking about it, to their own staff and then eventually in press conferences. And so it's unclear, what sort of due diligence the Humboldt County Sheriff specifically did or did not do. But he repeatedly said, this comes from intelligence from the California Highway Patrol and said they were the ones who had the evidence. And from what we can gather, that only evidence was just 2 individual screenshots. And CHP has even told me that that is the evidence that they had at the time. And it's, not very much.
And when CHP was passing this along, did they say, okay, we have these screenshots, we haven't verified them, we don't know if this really suggests, but just so you know what sort of, was there any sort of caution that was issued along with these emails and texts and messages?
It doesn't appear that way. On the contrary, it was treated with quite seriousness from the get-go. We see it was just sent along initially saying, please look into this. This was a chief sending it to her staff. And then, within an hour, you have another official passing it along to a further group of staff saying something like, the thought is these buses are roaming, looking for events to attend and possibly cause problems. And one of them did have this grainy image of a van with a Black Lives Matter, slogan written on the back. It's unclear where that photo came from, but obviously there are, potential very serious consequences here if, vans are being stopped, or if there's someone who does have a Black Lives Matter, slogan on their car, being stopped. And yeah, I mean, there was not a lot of disclaimers with these messages being passed along. It was kind of treated as a very serious threat from the start. And that's why they launched, aerial surveillance to potentially look for a bus, and they obviously didn't find anything.
Right. I mean, to launch an aircraft in the sky, I mean, suggests a certain level of institutional ignorance in this part of California, maybe Southern Oregon. I gather that these small communities, they're almost all white, mostly agricultural. Perhaps there's a lot of weed that's being grown. I assume that they don't have much of an interaction with people who support Black Lives Matter or might sympathize with Antifa.
Yeah, I mean, these are more conservative, white, rural communities in California. However, there are groups of protesters who were active in Black Lives Matter activism, and these just smaller protests, in honor of George Floyd, just like there were all across the country during this uprising. But yeah, there aren't these big organized groups, and certainly there are no people traveling from city to city. I mean, the rumor in this case was literally that there was some sort of bus of violent protesters traveling from Oregon to California and just stopping from place to place to cause mayhem, and that just has no relationship to any kind of organization, whether it's anti-fascist activists or Black Lives Matter. Just has no relationship to reality.
Yeah, and you would think that if there really was a bus loaded with people who were going to cause mayhem, that police at the state level and also the local level would have some ability to verify, does this bus really exist? Where is it? What's the location? What are the plate numbers? I mean, there's all sorts of things that you would expect a law enforcement agency to be able to do if that situation was real.
Yeah, and I mean, these rumors have had really catastrophic consequences at various times. I mean, the most sort of prominent example in California was that there were rumors that, Antifa was starting the wildfires, which have obviously been very devastating here. And that led just sort of civilians to take up arms and set up these, blockades to stop people from traveling in and questioning them whether they were Antifa, including people who were evacuating fires. So, these are not just, small incidents that have little consequences. These can have cause substantial harm. This is the real sort of impact of misinformation.
Yeah, and you can imagine, an African-American family that might be traveling through Northern California and traveling up the coast and just so happens to have either a Black Lives Matter bumper sticker, whatever it is. They are going into a community that is fearful and frightened, and suddenly they get pulled over for no reason. Then somehow they are quote unquote suspicious. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Have there been any apologies? Has there been any effort by law enforcement to say, okay, we got it wrong, and here's what we're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?
No, there hasn't been. I have not seen that with California Highway Patrol or the Humboldt Sheriff, which were the main agencies that I was writing about in this case. They've just sort of said, oh, this wasn't. They've sort of tried to downplay, the operation that they launched in response, basically saying, oh, this wasn't a major operation, and that the aircraft was only in the air for a couple minutes looking for this bus, things like that. But they have not, apologized.
And what's been the reaction to the reporting that you've done on all of this? I mean, has there been much reaction from members of the community? Has there been, tell me what you've heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are just really outraged by it. I've, heard from folks in Humboldt County specifically who said, they weren't surprised just because of their sort of past experiences. And, when this happened last year, this was, sort of a big story locally because there was a lot of questions to that sheriff. And so there were already people who were upset with the sheriff repeating these rumors. And I think the reporting that we've done here, which came from these records from Property of the People, which is a nonprofit group that had obtained them, shows that, there was actually quite an operation behind the scenes. And so that has just further fueled people's, outrage at this, because it is very, distressing and disturbing to know that this is, how law enforcement receives information and acts upon it, and the potential consequences there.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of discretion, particularly from the sheriff in Humboldt County, is remarkable. And I assume that he's still there. He's still in his job.
He is, yes, and he has just stood by what he said at the time, and I didn't speak to him directly, and obviously spoke to his spokesperson throughout this, and as they've sort of reiterated, this came from the CHP, and we were just passing that along, and the CHP was the one that launched the aerial surveillance, and so they bear that responsibility. But certainly he was the one who spread these rumors publicly by talking about it in press conferences and subsequent press statements when he was questioned on it.
Sam Levin, he's a correspondent for The Guardian. Sam, terrific work on this story. We really appreciate you sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got it.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.